A ranking of Super Bowl champions makes one thing perfectly clear. Every team on this list is a Super Bowl champion. For whatever anyone might want to say about some of these teams, that they were a fluke, that they didn't deserve it, or anything else, the bottom line is that these teams did win the Super Bowl. The parameters were set out at the beginning of each season, and even more specifically at the beginning of the postseason, and those parameters were met. Nothing can ever take these championships away from these teams. That said, yes, there is a hierarchy, and not all Super Bowl champions are created equally. And we're here today to rank the 58 teams that lay claim to Super Bowl championships. Moreover, because we use data and not feelings, this is a true ranking of these 58 teams. Before we jump into this, I want to take a moment to thank you very much for clicking on this video. In this ranking series, we usually have 10 teams that we go through, so this is going to be a longer one. It's worth it though to see who the best of the best really is in the NFL. If you're not subscribed to this channel, please take a moment to consider doing so. We have all kinds of content, and you're certain to find a whole bunch of stuff to interest you. Ding that bell for future notifications as well. As is always the case, we will be using this channel's metric for determining these rankings, C-score. A deeper explanation of our methods is in the description below. Generally though, the way C-score works is that if two teams were to line up against each other, the team with the higher C-score would be expected to win based on overall team quality. Of course, football games are determined by so much more than just team quality, as there's good games, bad games, injuries, penalties, and all of that, and upsets happen. But in a vacuum, this is where these teams lie. Now, some of these rankings are decided by the finest of margins in C-score, and seeing one team 8 spots or so behind another doesn't necessarily mean that they're a whole lot worse. Keep that in mind when you see where everyone is listed. And we must say as clearly as possible, yes, a team's record is important, but it's not everything, and there will be instances where a team with a worse record ranks higher than a team with a better record. And because C-score is not so easily blinded the way traditional sports media and so-called experts are by what they think they see, some placement in these rankings may come as a surprise to many. Stay tuned to find out where these surprises lie. Here at number 58 though, the bottom of these rankings, it probably isn't too much surprise to see the 2011 New York Giants. Taking a look at what we have up here, it's most of the relevant information for each of these teams that we're covering. Their C-score, their overall record, including how they did in 1-score games and in 2+ score games, how many points they scored, allowed, their ranking in that category, their strength of schedule that year, and what they did in the playoffs. Looking at the Giants, they're the only team to ever be outscored during the regular season and win the Super Bowl. In fact, they were in the bottom quarter of points allowed in the league, 25th in that category. They were 4-4 in games decided by 2 scores or more. Not a very good overall performance. Now their C-score is under 10, 9.227, barely an above average team. But if it wasn't for their good strength of schedule and the fact that they got the playoffs off to a good start, they would be even lower than that. They won their Super Bowl by defeating the New England Patriots for the second time in 4 seasons. The Giants jumped out to a 9-0 first quarter lead before the Patriots took the lead back at 10-9 going into halftime. From there, it was nip and tuck with the Patriots holding on to a 17-15 fourth quarter lead. The Giants got the ball back at their own 12-yard line, where Mario Manningham famously made this catch on the sideline for a 38-yard gain to get that drive started. Not long thereafter, Ahmad Bradshaw plunged in for the winning touchdown, the defense held, and the Giants had the most improbable Super Bowl victory of all time. It's almost as if the Giants of this era went on multiple unexpected Super Bowl runs, with the 2007 team coming in next at number 57. This Giant team wasn't a whole lot better than the one we just looked at. They outscored their opponents by 24 points during the regular season, 1.5 points per game, and they took 5 losses by 2 scores or more. Their 5-1 record in these one-score games here, if a couple of those games go the wrong way, they're not even in the playoffs. They did okay in the playoffs, winning all 4 of their games, of course, but only one of them by more than 1 score. This, however, is almost certainly the most famous football game of the 21st century, and alongside Super Bowl III and the 1958 NFL Championship game, has a claim for the most famous football game of all time. The explosive, record-setting Patriots offense was limited to 14 points the entire game, less than 40% of their average during the regular season, all under the relentless pass rush of the Giants' defense. When Plaxico Burress hauled in the game-winning touchdown, the Patriots' dream of an undefeated season was over, and the Giants ascended the mountaintop. Oh yeah, the helmet catch happened in this game too. We now venture back in time to the first post-merger season, 1970, and that season's champion, the Baltimore Colts. The Colts had trotted out much better teams than this, especially the 68 team, but this is the year they broke through, and their 6-0 record in one-score games is a big reason why. Technically 6-0-1, but a tie is really a 0-score game. Their defense was pretty good, their offense was pretty good, both ranking in the top 10 in scoring. The strength of schedule, not so much. They had an easy beginning to their playoff run, but then had to get through 2 very well-known teams to get their championship. Super Bowl V, which the Colts won 16-13 on a last-second field goal from rookie kicker Jim O'Brien, is known not so affectionately as the Blunder Bowl. The Colts' first touchdown was a 75-yard tipped pass to John Mackey, wherein O'Brien's extra point was blocked. The Colts benched their starting quarterback Johnny Unitas, and their other 2 scoring drives were on drives that went 3 yards each. Oh, and the Colts committed 7 turnovers while forcing 4 of their own. The game was such a mess that Chuck Howley from the Dallas Cowboys, who lost the game, was named the MVP. But hey, the Colts didn't finish last on this list. They have the 21st century New York Giants to thank for that. Next up are the 2012 Baltimore Ravens at number 55. Funny story, I remember this season that once the divisional round was set, I declared that the 7 best teams in the NFL were remaining, and also the Ravens. Well, joke's on me and anyone else who thought the same thing. That thought didn't come out of nowhere though. This was a quite pedestrian team at 10-6, 10 different games being decided by 1 score and going 6-4 in those games. 10th in points, 12th in points allowed, middle of the road schedule, but they got going in the playoffs and very famously beat the Denver Broncos in the divisional round, sending the game into overtime on a Hail Mary and then winning it in double overtime. Now, to say that this was an infamous Super Bowl would be a bit of an understatement. First off, it was the Har Bowl, with brothers John and Jim coaching the Ravens and the 49ers respectively. But it was also the Blackout Bowl, with an incomprehensible power outage during the damn Super Bowl, delaying the game for 34 minutes. The Ravens led by 22 points before that, and the break in the action gave the aging 49ers defense time to recover and get back in the game. While the final score of 34-31 made the game look close, in reality, Baltimore took the lead in the first quarter and then never trailed. Interesting note that our first 2 entries were from the same city, and so too were our last 2 entries, despite being 2 different franchises. Now we have what might be our first surprise to many of you, the most recent Super Bowl champions, the 2023 Kansas City Chiefs. These guys went 6-5 in one-score games. That's a lot of one-score games that could have gone in either direction, and only finished with an overall 11-6 record. It was the defense that carried the load here, allowing 294 points, good for second in the league. This asterisk we see next to the SOS means that they finished 23rd, but they finished in a tie. We're going to see that asterisk come up with a lot of teams a bit later. What they did do, though, was go on a good playoff run beating some good teams. Just like with the 2011 Giants, the Chiefs were playing the same team they defeated in the Super Bowl exactly 4 years earlier. And also, just like the Giants, these Chiefs won the rematch as well. They were certainly the first team in Super Bowl history to be trailing the game in overtime to still win it. It was only the second overtime game in Super Bowl history, and given the nature of the new overtime rules, it became the longest game in Super Bowl history at 74 minutes and 57 seconds of clock time. But, as has been the case throughout this recent Chiefs run, when it mattered most, they played well enough to squeeze out the win. We've got a few Patriots teams to go through, and we begin with the one that started it all, the 2001 squad. Scheduling quirks of a 31 NFL team allowed these Patriots a lot of time off to heal up toward the end of the season, and it paid off during their playoff run, where they won their 3 games by a total of 13 points. They were decent in both scoring and allowing scoring at 6th in both categories, but their schedule, not just last in the league, dead last. Their combined opponents that season didn't have much fight to put up, yet the Patriots went 11-5, not a bad record in a vacuum against that schedule. Bill Belichick led a defensive game plan in Super Bowl 25 as the D coordinator of the New York Giants, a team we will see later in the countdown, that literally got put into the Hall of Fame. His game plan in this game wasn't so different. Be physical with the Rams' offense, concentrate more on the passing game than the running game, and force turnovers. And it worked, to the tune of a defensive pick 6 and a 17-3 lead in the fourth quarter. The powerhouse Rams offense almost made a comeback, but Adam Vinatieri ended things with yet another clutch field goal in the playoffs. And so it went for these early 2000s Patriot squads. The first properly recognized wildcard team to win the Super Bowl is our number 52 entry, the 1980 Oakland Raiders. The Raiders were fairly solid across the board, an 11-5 record, going 6-2 in games decided by more than one score, 7th in scoring, 10th in points allowed, tied for 9th in strength of schedule. They just didn't have anything that stood out about them to get that C-score any higher than it got to. Their opponents in Super Bowl XV, the Philadelphia Eagles, were the favorites to win the game, but it was never really in doubt. Oakland jumped out to a 14-0 first quarter lead and didn't allow a touchdown until early in the fourth quarter, which only served to lessen their lead from 24-3 to 24-10. A quick look at the box score wouldn't indicate that the Raiders dominated the game, but for one statistic, the Raiders never turned the ball over, while Philadelphia turned it over 4 times. Pretty tough to overcome that. The Raiders ultimately won the game 27-10, matching the score from Super Bowl XII. This was the first time a Super Bowl score had ever repeated, something that has only ever happened one more time. We have another recent team that just misses the top 50, the 2021 Los Angeles Rams, the first and to date the only Rams team to win the Super Bowl while in LA. This was the first NFL season to have 17 regular season games, so the Rams went 12-5 and finished as the lowest division champion. Part of the reason for that was their defense, middle of the pack, giving up 372 points, but they were buoyed by 8 multiple score victories. They got off to a great start in the playoffs, defeating the Cardinals by 23, but then won each of their subsequent games by just 3 points. On the heels of those 3-point wins came their 3-point win against the Cincinnati Bengals in Super Bowl 56. While many may remember the game-winning touchdown catch by Cooper Kupp, it was, ironically, the Rams' defense that secured this win, locking down the Bengals' offense, allowing just 3 points from 6 strides after T. Higgins' 75-yard touchdown reception to start the second half, which itself could be argued should have been called back on a penalty. And that D was led by an all-time great, the recently retired Aaron Donald, making the play on the last play to end matters for the Rams. We now begin the top 50 with the last of the Patriots Super Bowl winning teams from 2018. Nothing special about this team really, a pedestrian record against a very low-ranked strength of schedule that got to the Super Bowl because of a flub by the Chiefs' defense in the AFC title game. Does the name Dee Ford ring a bell? But they did make it to that Super Bowl, and it's pretty amazing that in an era of offensive football, where the vast majority of rules are in place to produce more offense, that this Super Bowl, played in February 2019, was the lowest scoring Super Bowl of all time, and the record was broken by nearly 25%. In yet another example of masterful defensive game planning by Bill Belichick, the Patriots held a Sean McVay offense to just 3 points, as compared to their near 33-point average in the regular season. There isn't much to write home about in this game. Defensive football can certainly be intriguing and exciting. That just wasn't this game. At number 49 is the first of our 2 Super Bowl champions from a season with a work stoppage, the 1987 Washington Redskins. Now, they had an 11-4 record, which means only 1 game was properly canceled, but 3 more were played under replacement players, and the Redskins went 3-0 in those games, meaning they went 8-4 with their regular roster. Top 5 in scoring, top 10 in defensive scoring, a very low strength of schedule, and they got some breaks in the playoffs by not having to play either the 49ers or the Saints, the 2 teams with the best record in the entire NFL that year. This team is likely more fondly remembered, especially for a team coming in at number 49. But the reason for that was because of its performance in the Super Bowl. After falling behind 10-0 in the first quarter, the Redskins blew the doors off their hinges with 35 points in the second quarter alone, scoring 5 touchdowns, including 3 of at least 50 yards, and 1 of those going 80 yards. They compiled over 600 yards of offense and just missed having a 200-yard rusher and a 200-yard receiver, as Ricky Sanders finished with only 193 receiving yards. Believe it or not, this 10-point come-from-behind victory stood as the Super Bowl record for decades, a beautiful ending to a mostly mediocre season. Let's venture back into the surprise territory. Barely escaping our bottom 10 are the 2015 Denver Broncos. This team is remembered as having a legendary defense, and they certainly gave those kinds of performances in the playoffs, but they were only 4th in the regular season in points allowed. That's not legendary by any means. They were also outside the top 10 in points scored and went 9-3 in 1-score games. A few of those games go the other way, it might look a lot different. But like our previous entry, almost the entirety of this team's memory lies in their Super Bowl performance, which is crazy to think because it was only 8 seasons ago. But they played the 15-1 Carolina Panthers, who had just dropped 49 points in the NFC title game, and dominated them, holding them to just 10 points, while accruing 7 sacks, forcing 4 turnovers, and scoring a touchdown of their own. This is the dominant Broncos defense that people remember. But as we just saw with the numbers, this just wasn't the overall case. It's crazy to think that this is still, more than 8 years later, the most recent playoff appearance for the Broncos. We saw last season's Chiefs earlier in the countdown. Now we get to see the prior season's team, the 2022 version, in at number 47. On the surface, things look great. A 14-3 record, going 7-0 in multiple score games, leading the league in scoring. But they finished right in the middle of the pack in defensive scoring, had a very weak strength of schedule, and didn't exactly dominate throughout the playoffs, winning their 3 games against kinda so-so competition in the AFC, no disrespect to the Jaguars and the Bengals, by a total of 13 points. To many, their Super Bowl victory over the Philadelphia Eagles was one of, if not the greatest Super Bowls ever played. It was certainly high scoring and mostly lacking in defense. To many others, it was one of, if not the most controversial Super Bowls ever played, on account of the field conditions and questionable officiating, especially the holding call on Philly late in the game, setting up KC's game-winning field goal. But In a testament to the Chiefs truly being carried by their offense this season, the Eagles set the Super Bowl record for most points scored by a losing team. Of all the excellent Colts teams throughout the late 90s into the next decade, it was this team in 2006 that finally captured the Super Bowl. The two primary reasons why they rank even as high as they do is the fact that they finished second in scoring and finished tied for the fourth most difficult schedule in the league. Perhaps all the wear and tear of the previous seasons gave them the grit they needed to finally get through a playoff run. Of note also, 8 one-score victories. These guys got away with a lot of games that they could have easily lost. Now, I don't have the official records, but this would have to be the rainiest Super Bowl on record. It was coming down this day in Miami, and the game mostly reflected that. After withstanding an opening kickoff return touchdown by Devin Hester, the Colts took control of the game by pounding 42 runs for 191 yards, with their only touchdown pass coming on a broken play where Reggie Wayne was left wide open for the 53-yard score. With a 5-point lead in the fourth quarter, Kelvin Hayden ended matters for the Colts with a 56-yard pick six, and the Colts had finally broken through for their first and, to date, only Super Bowl win in Indianapolis. We kick off another dynasty at number 45 with the 1981 San Francisco 49ers. This is our first team in the countdown to cross over the 20-point threshold in C-score. This team came out of nowhere to go 13-3. They did go 7-2 in one-score games, had a middle-of-the-road strength of schedule, and didn't exactly dominate when it came to the playoffs, but they were second in the league in points allowed. Indeed, the 49ers were known for their blowout Super Bowl wins throughout the 80s and 90s, but the Bengals always gave them a close game. This one wasn't quite as close as the final score may indicate, however. The Niners led 20-0 at the half, and the closest the game ever got was when the Bengals scored with just 20 seconds remaining to give us that 26-21 final. This game, though, will always be remembered for the 49ers goal line stand. With little time remaining in the third quarter and the Bengals threatening to take back the momentum, the 49ers made 4 stops from inside the 3-yard line to preserve their 20-7 lead. Dan Buns and Hacksaw Reynolds will forever be 49er luminaries. We go back-to-back with the 49ers, this time checking in with the 1988 team at number 44. This wasn't a quintessential 49er team. They were mired at 6-5 during the season before winning 4 straight, losing the last game to end at 10-6. They were 5-4 in one-score games and finished inside the top 10 in both points scored and allowed, but not very emphatically. They got off to a great start in the NFC playoffs, but it was the Super Bowl that this team is remembered for. This one against the Bengals was a properly close game, with no team leading at any point by more than 7 points. The 49ers defense was stout, keeping the high-powered Bengals out of the end zone for the entire game, only allowing a Stanford Jennings kickoff return for a touchdown. But, trailing 16-13 with just over 3 minutes remaining and 92 yards away from the end zone, the 49ers made their way all the way down the field, ending matters with a 10-yard game-winning touchdown reception by John Taylor with only 34 seconds remaining. The 1987 team that fell in the playoffs was better than this one, but it was this team that brought home the Lombardi. We will be getting our first team from the pre-merger era, the famous 1968 New York Jets. Not so famous for their overall play on the field, though. An 11-3 record is nice, but it was accomplished in a very weak division. So weak, in fact, that the Jets had the AFL's easiest strength of schedule, while still only finishing second in points scored, fourth in points allowed, and got a nice little gift in the AFL title game, having to play a Raiders team traveling across the country after having played a game the week before. But once again, this team is famous because of this Super Bowl. The Baltimore Colts were an amazing football team in 1968. so the fact that they were 18-point favorites against the Jets was no surprise. The way the game played out, though, was the Jets turned the Colts over 5 times, collected 2 sacks, and pounded away with the running game to the tune of 43 rushes for 142 yards, 121 yards, and the Jets' only touchdown coming from fullback Matt Snell, who also added 40 receiving yards. Joe Namath gets all the credit and was named the game's MVP, but in reality, he had very little to do with this outcome. Whatever price the Jets owed the Devil to win this game still hasn't been paid in full, as they have yet to even reach another Super Bowl in the 55 years since this game. We have the third of 6 Patriots teams before we've even escaped the bottom 20. At number 42 is the 2003 team. On the surface, this may seem low. 14-2 is a great record, especially after starting the year 2-2. But they went 8-1 in one-score games, and once again, those are games that can kind of go in either direction. The offense was nothing special, finishing 12th in scoring, but the defense was very good as they led the league in that category. They probably shouldn't have beat the Tennessee Titans in the divisional round. Drew Bennett did them a big favor, and they got their way into another Super Bowl without truly dominating. And this Super Bowl here is perhaps the only one more well known for its halftime show than the game itself, but it was a wild affair nonetheless. 0 points were scored in the first and third quarters, but 61 points were scored in the second and fourth quarters. In a back and forth affair, the Panthers tied things up at 29 apiece with just over a minute remaining, before Panthers kicker John Casey famously, or infamously, sent the kickoff out of bounds to set up the Patriots with excellent field position. Just a few plays later, and Adam Vinatieri was back for another game-winning field goal. Each team scored 4 touchdowns and 1 field goal, yet New England had the best of it in the end, 32-29. The other NFL franchise with 6 Super Bowl wins are the Pittsburgh Steelers, but the 2005 squad is our first look at them. Another team that needed to surge late, that 11-5 record is more impressive than it looks on the surface. 2-4 record in one-score games, a 9-1 record in multiple score games. Top 10 in scoring, 3rd in points allowed, and a pretty good run through the playoffs where they only needed to beat one team by 1 score, that being the number 1 seeded Indianapolis Colts. Before 1990, only 5 teams per conference made the playoffs. The 6th team and the 6th seed was introduced in 1990, but it took until 2005 before that seed produced a Super Bowl winner. Then this was it. Super Bowl 40 against the Seahawks was notorious for some questionable calls against the Seahawks. With a 21-10 final score, one might wonder whether or not the officiating truly made a difference, but there appears to be no doubt that it played at least a factor. Bill Levy, head referee, over 4 years later, admitting to making mistakes on at least 2 calls. Levy, like other officials, are only human, but a giant what-if lingers over this one. We move to the top 40, but we stay with the Steelers and the beginning of their dynasty in 1974. The Steelers had been knocking on the door of the Super Bowl, but this is the year they broke through. Their C-score is the first one we see to cross over 25 points. They went 10-3-1 and more impressively went 6-1 in multiple score games, finishing 2nd in the league in points allowed. Not a stellar strength of schedule, but not really at the bottom either. It's their playoff run that helped push them a little forward here. A playoff run that culminated in the Super Bowl. Sure, the Steel Curtain is a fancy nickname, but in this, their first ever Super Bowl appearance, it was an appropriate one as well. There has never been a shutout in the Super Bowl, but on 2 occasions, a defense has pitched a shutout, and this was one of them. In fact, the Steelers' defense scored more points than they allowed in this one, opening the game with a safety. They won 16-6, where the Vikings scored a touchdown by recovering a blocked punt in the end zone before missing the extra point. It's tough to imagine a quarterback completing fewer than 10 passes for fewer than 100 yards in a Super Bowl win, but that happened here. The New York Giants have returned to the countdown at number 39 with the 1990 Super Bowl winning squad. The Giants started the season red hot at 10-0, concurrent with the 49ers' 10-0 start. They were set up to meet 2 weeks later, but they both took a loss beforehand, and then the Giants lost that game to the Niners. It derailed their momentum a little bit, with their season finishing at 13-3 with only a so-so offense, but they had the number one scoring defense in the league and powered out 8 multiple score victories. It's in the playoffs, though, that they started barely scraping by, including an NFC title game that, as a 49er fan, I don't like to talk about. 1 year after the biggest blowout in Super Bowl history, we had the closest game in Super Bowl history, and by definition, the closest game possible. We talked about Bill Belichick's literal Hall of Fame game plan in this one, but it still could have all come undone in the game's final seconds. To this point, only once had a field goal attempt been made in the waning seconds of the game that could have won it. Jim O'Brien made that kick in Super Bowl V for the Colts, but had he missed it, the game would have gone to overtime. Here, when Scott Norwood missed this one, it was over, and the Giants got away with the 20-19 victory. Their combined victory in the NFC title game and Super Bowl of 3 total points is unlikely to ever be matched and can only be broken by 1 point. The first team outside of our bottom 20 are the fake NFL season Super Bowl champions of 2020, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Here are their relevant stats, but for a much deeper look at this, check out the video in the upper right corner, specifically the section entitled The 2020 Season and Other Assorted Details. As someone who has watched every Super Bowl ever played, 41 of them live as they happened, I can say with a strong degree of certainty that as far as the quality of the game goes, this would rank at the very bottom. The Tampa Bay drive extended 2 different times by penalties, the Chiefs' offensive line beat up beyond all recognition, and the season that preceded it riddled with inconsistency within the execution of league protocols. The less time spent on this, the better. The 2008 Pittsburgh Steelers, to date the last of their 6 Super Bowl wins, sit here at number 37. And with a more dynamic offense, they certainly would have ranked much higher, only finishing 20th in the league in scoring. But they had the number 1 scoring defense, a very strong number 4 overall strength of schedule, and went an even 6-2 in both one-score games and multiple score games. And they won both of their games heading into the Super Bowl by multiple scores as well. And that Super Bowl is objectively one of the greatest Super Bowls ever played, even though their opponents, the Arizona Cardinals, are among the worst teams to ever make it to the big game. Everyone remembers the Santonio Holmes toe tap in the end zone to win the game, and that was a great play. Lots of other people remember Larry Fitzgerald catch and run to put the Cardinals in the lead, and that too was a great play. But the best play of this game, and in my humble opinion, the single greatest play in NFL history, was James Harrison's pick 6 to end the first half. I stated as much when that play happened, and I maintain that opinion. This Harrison play will one day be getting its own video. We now have our second Super Bowl champion from a season with a work stoppage, and wouldn't you know it, it's the Washington Redskins again, this time from 1982. Now this stoppage was much longer and included no replacement games, so the final regular season record for the Redskins was 8-1. Yes, only 9 games were played. They did lead the league in scoring during this time, and they went 4-1 in multiple score games, then proceeded to have a playoff run of all multiple score games. But it wasn't always looking that way in the Super Bowl. So many Super Bowls are defined by one single play, whether fairly or unfairly. The one play that this Super Bowl is judged by qualifies as eminently fair. With the Redskins trailing by 4 in the fourth quarter, Facing a 4th and 1, head coach Joe Gibbs sent out the offense to get the first down. He knew he had the right combination to do so. The bruising John Riggins running behind the Hogs, Washington's always stellar offensive line. Riggins got that yard all right. In fact, he got all 43 yards that stood between the line of scrimmage and the end zone. With that play, everything thereafter fell Washington's way, and they added another touchdown to win the franchise's first Super Bowl. Of the 3 Chiefs title-winning teams in the modern era, it was their first in 2019 that was their best. After the D4 disappointment of 2018, the Chiefs came back strong in 2019. That 12-4 record includes a 5-4 record in one-score games, not a really big number there, proving their worth here with a 7-0 record in multiple score games. 5th in scoring, 7th in allowing, an 11th best overall schedule is pretty strong. The Chiefs found themselves trailing by 10 points in the 4th quarter of this Super Bowl, and their opponents, the San Francisco 49ers, had the ball. Being down by double digits was nothing new to the Chiefs in this playoff run, though. They faced that scenario, or worse, in every game to that point before coming back to win. And, well, they're on this list of Super Bowl champions, so clearly they came back to win this one as well. Buoyed by a spectacular 3rd and long conversion by Tyreek Hill, the Chiefs ran off 21 straight 4th quarter points to win their first ever post-merger Super Bowl. In their first full season after leaving Oakland, the newly minted Los Angeles Raiders won the Super Bowl in 1983 and come in at number 34 on this list. This is clearly a good team. A C-score of 29 and change is nothing to sneeze at, but it just didn't seem to jump all the way out even though they were 12-4. Part of the reason for that was that their defense was essentially middle of the pack, finishing 13th in points allowed. They did leave a statement of notice, though, when they took care of the Steelers by 28 in the divisional round and the Seahawks by 16 in the AFC title game. That brought them to Super Bowl XVIII, where they were underdogs to the defending champion Washington Redskins, and for good reason. The Redskins set a then NFL record for points scored, led the league in point differential, and went 14-2 with both losses by a single point. The Raiders surprisingly led 14-3 as the first half was nearing an end when Joe Theismann inexplicably threw a pick six to Raider linebacker Jack Squirick, and the bloodbath was on. Marcus Allen's electrifying 74-yard touchdown run at the end of the 3rd quarter put the exclamation point on a 38-9 drubbing, at the time the largest Super Bowl blowout of all time. We return to the pre-merger era in 1967, where the Super Bowl champions were once again the Green Bay Packers. This wasn't quite the same Packer team that had dominated the NFL throughout the 60s. Running on their last legs, they finished the season 9-4-1, but showed their overall power with a 6-0 record in multiple score games. The offense this season was middle of the pack, but the defense was still pretty strong. They took care of a good Ram team in the divisional round before winning the famous Ice Bowl against the Cowboys to get to Super Bowl II. Now, despite the 13.5 point spread in favor of the Packers, on paper, the Raiders were maybe actually a better team than they were. One could argue legitimately that the Raiders played weaker competition in the AFL, but they rostered 5 future Hall of Famers with 11 Pro Bowlers this season and 6 AP first-team All-Pros. The mystique of the Packers, though, was too much in the end. They got on the board 4 times in the first half, albeit with 3 field goals. They put 17 more points on the board in the second half, en route to a fairly dominant 33-14 victory in what was the end of the Lombardi era in Green Bay. What a way to go out. The Oakland Raiders return, and in what will be a surprise to many, this 1976 13-1 unit only checks in at number 32 in this countdown. In going 13-1, they only had 6 one-score games, and they did win all 6 of those games. The defense finished 12th in the league in points allowed, essentially middle of the pack. They only barely escaped the New England Patriots in the divisional round on a very controversial roughing the passer call against the Patriots. But they made it into Super Bowl XI, and in doing so, the Raiders jumped out all over the Vikings in the first half of that game, as every team pretty much did against the Vikings during their 4 Super Bowl appearances over the previous 8 seasons. The Vikings never could score in the first half of those games, and the Raiders kept that tradition alive with a 16-0 halftime lead. With the game fairly secured, one of the most iconic plays in NFL history took place when all-time legend corner Willie Brown intercepted Fran Tarkenton's pass intended for Sammy White and ran it back 75 yards for the touchdown. What made this play so iconic was its rendering by NFL Films, perfectly encapsulating Brown's sheer guts and determination. This will be our first visit to the Cowboys dynasty of the 1990s, and our first visit to the Cowboys period, and it was their final title in 1995 that just misses the top 30 here in the number 31 spot. Speaking of 30 though, they are the first team on this countdown to break the 30-point barrier in C-score, and they did it before its halfway point. That's how good a lot of these teams are. Their 12-4 record was perfectly balanced with a third best scoring offense and scoring defense, a top 10 schedule, and a stellar 10-1 record in 2-score games. In Super Bowl 30, the Cowboys led 13-7 when Steelers quarterback Neil O'Donnell forgot what team he was playing for and threw the ball straight to Cowboys corner Larry Brown, who promptly intercepted that ball. It then became 20-7, but the Steelers fought back to make it 20-17, and they had the ball back before O'Donnell once again forgot what team he played for, and once again Larry Brown intercepted the pass, and once again the Cowboys turned that into a touchdown. Dallas earned the win by jumping out to a lead, but it sure seemed like they were trying to lose it. The 27-17 final score remains, to date, only the second time a Super Bowl final score has been repeated. The number 30 spot also brings us to the end of the bottom half of these standings, and the team we have here are the 2010 Green Bay Packers. The Packers joined the 2005 Steelers as the only other 6th seed to win the Super Bowl. Their record at 10-6 doesn't look imposing, but they only went 4-6 in 1-score games. Flip just 2 of those games, all of a sudden they're 12-4 and looking great. They were top 10 in points scored, points allowed, and strength of schedule. In fact, they were second in the league in points allowed. And after a slow start in the first round of the playoffs, they got on a good run to get to the Super Bowl. And for our second straight entry, the Steelers, as the opponents, attempted a large comeback only to fall short. The Packers had already jumped out to a 7-0 lead in the first quarter, when only 24 seconds later, Nick Barnett ran back an interception for a touchdown to make it 14-0. Their lead got as high as 21-3 before the Steelers took it all the way down to 28-25. Green Bay added a field goal, and the defense held on for the odd-looking final score of 31-25. This was Jordy Nelson's breakout game, only the second 100-yard receiving day of his career, and a career high to that point. Something I'll always remember because I bet his over in that game and won it by halftime. Perhaps another surprise entry here, as it may surprise some to see that the 2000 Baltimore Ravens are only starting off the top half of this countdown. Part of what caused that was a 5-game stretch where the Ravens literally scored a grand total of 0 touchdowns. They actually went 2-3 in that stretch when most teams would probably go 0-5. The reason for that, their number 1 scoring defense, only allowing 165 points for the season, just over 10 points per game. What hurt them was their overall strength of schedule, 29th out of 31 in the league. We mentioned the 1974 Pittsburgh Steelers pitching a defensive shutout in their Super Bowl. This Ravens team was the other one to pull off that feat. This is a forgettable Super Bowl to many, as the Ravens dominated what can be generously described as a so-so Giants team. But what people will remember is the 3 touchdowns scored in a span of just 36 seconds of clock time, starting with Dwayne Starks' pick 6 for the Ravens, followed by Ron Dixon returning the ensuing kickoff for a touchdown, only for Jermaine Lewis to do the same for the Ravens. Not the most memorable of the 4 Baltimore versus New York title games, that's for sure. Let's now take a look at a fairly recent team at number 28 in the 2017 Philadelphia Eagles. Late in the season, Eagles quarterback Carson Wentz, the clear frontrunner for NFL MVP, got injured and would not be able to return. He was replaced by Nick Foles, and many wrote this team off. People tend to forget that football is a team sport. This team finished 13-3 with an 8-1 record in multiple score games, finished 3rd in scoring and 4th in points allowed. They struggled a little bit in their first playoff game, but brought the hammer down on the Vikings in the NFC title game. This Super Bowl, Super Bowl 52, missed becoming the highest scoring Super Bowl of all time by a single point, but it does qualify as the highest scoring close Super Bowl of all time. A back and forth affair got turned around in the favor of the Eagles when longtime pass rusher Brandon Graham broke through for a fourth quarter strip sack, allowing the Eagles to extend their lead to 8 points. But don't be fooled. By far the most famous play of this game was the Philly Special, where tight end Trey Burton completed a touchdown pass to quarterback Nick Foles. The discussion on the sideline where this play was called was made into a statue after all. And now we go right to the year before at number 27, where we have the 2016 New England Patriots. This was truly an excellent Patriot team, going 14-2 and racking up 10 multiple score victories. They finished 3rd in scoring, and they finished 1st in points allowed. But as has often been the case with the Patriots, they were dead last in strength of schedule. And that continued somehow in the playoffs, where they played 2 teams that got well beyond the point where they deserved to be. But then came the Super Bowl, and this Super Bowl is always remembered incorrectly. No, I'm not trying to deceive you. The Patriots were indeed down 28-3 pretty late in the 3rd quarter before tying the game in regulation, doing the most predictable thing in the history of the world by winning the overtime coin toss, then marching down the field against a completely spent Falcons defense to win the game. What we're remembering incorrectly is that the Patriots made the comeback, when in reality, the Atlanta Falcons 100% choked the game away. The offensive coordinator that day, Kyle Shanahan, was the main culprit, and that legacy of his has continued as head coach of my 49ers. By its official definition, the 1997 Denver Broncos are our highest ranked wild-card Super Bowl winner at number 26. It was the 96 Bronco team that was considered very excellent before they lost in a massive upset to the Jacksonville Jaguars. In this season, they faced the Jaguars again in the wild-card round, where they exacted their revenge. This is a 12-4 team that won 9 games by multiple scores, only going 3-2 in one-score games. They led the league in scoring and were a very respectable 6th in points allowed. Indeed, this Super Bowl was one full year in the making. After the Broncos lost to the Jaguars in the 96 playoffs, they got to the big game this season with the Packers, who were defending their championship from the year before. Running back Terrell Davis led the way in this one, carrying the offense even while having to miss part of the game with a migraine. But John Elway stole the show with one of the Super Bowl's most famous plays, flinging his body into the air and getting helicoptered to the ground. He got that first down, the Broncos won the game, and in the process, they snapped the NFC's ridiculous 13-year winning streak over the AFC in the Super Bowl. Top 25 time, and starting us out are the repeat champions in 1993, the Dallas Cowboys. If you like balance, this team gave you balance. Second in scoring, second in points allowed. They went 8-2 in multiple score games and played a top 10 schedule. And on their way to the Super Bowl, they beat their two biggest rivals in the NFC playoffs. Now, not everyone may remember just how much trouble the Cowboys were in this game. They trailed the Bills by 7 at the beginning of the second half, and the Bills were driving. Then Leon Lett, vilified so much for his blunders in the previous season's Super Bowl and on Thanksgiving Day this year, reached out his bare paw and knocked the ball out of Thurman Thomas's hands. James Washington scooped it up, ran it back for a touchdown, and then the route was on. In the only time that the Super Bowl was a rematch from the previous season, Dallas outscored Buffalo 24-0 in the second half to wind up winning the game 30-13. In yet another instance of back-to-back entries from the same franchise, we head back to the first Dallas Cowboys championship team in 1971. At this time, the Cowboys were getting a little bit of a reputation for not being able to win the big one. They could never get through Lombardi's Packers. They finally made the Super Bowl in 1970, only to lose it. So they came into the 1971 season on a mission. They ended that season 11-3, going 8-1 in multiple score games. Their strength of schedule was the easiest in the league, but they did lead the league in scoring and didn't have an overly difficult time getting through the NFC and making it to the Super Bowl. For 47 seasons, the Dallas Cowboys held the record for the fewest points allowed in a Super Bowl. That is until it was tied by the New England Patriots in Super Bowl 53. So they still hold the record, but they now share it. They took the young Miami Dolphins to task in a steady, if unspectacular, 24-3 game, led by a serious ground and pound attack. Dallas ran the ball 48 times for 252 yards, yet no one player on the team had 20 carries or 100 yards, all while the Doomsday defense stifled the Dolphins' offense to just 185 total yards. In the end, it was a great relief to the Cowboy franchise to finally be known as champions. We've now made it to our fifth different Patriot team before we even get to the top 20, the 2014 squad. It's almost like they were sneaking out a bunch of Super Bowls that could have gone either way. In a shocking twist, this Patriot team actually had a difficult schedule this year, tied for 7th strongest in the league. They went 12-4, finishing in the top 10 in points scored and points allowed. And outside of their AFC title game dominance over the Colts, didn't win their other playoff games by a whole lot of points. That sits beside their 3-2 record in one-score games, which is actually a pretty good number. Malcolm Butler made the biggest play of Super Bowl 49. There is no doubt about that. And it's super appropriate that an undrafted free agent from a Division II school brought in by Bill Belichick would be in that position. But we're changing course a little bit here, and we're going to talk about the Seahawks. Everyone says that they should have run the ball here. You got Marshawn Lynch, so that makes sense. But so too did a pass play. Fake it to Marshawn. Roll out your athletic quarterback, and he'll have 3 choices. Dump it to an open receiver, likely a tight end, run it in yourself, or throw it into the 30th row and come back and try it again on 3rd down. Throwing the ball into a crowd of players was the single worst play call in NFL history, especially given the stakes. I ain't trying to hear the Colts fake punt or the Cowboys lining up Ezekiel Elliott at center. The Super Bowl was on the line here, and the Seahawks gave it away and threw away their chances at back-to-back Super Bowls and a slice of immortality. Idiots. All of them. Alright, let the controversy flow. The world-famous 1972 Miami Dolphins, the yearly champagne bottle poppers, the only undefeated team in the Super Bowl era, and considered by most quote, unquote, experts as the greatest team of all time only check in at number 22. That spot is deserved, and we're about to tell you why. Just look at those numbers there. They're 14-0. Only 3 of those games go into one score. Led the league in scoring, led the league in points allowed. But that strength of schedule, 26th, that's one thing. But it wasn't just that they finished last. They finished dead last in what was a weak NFL in 1972. After 3 games, every single team in the league had taken a loss already except the Dolphins. That is unheard of. Usually week 4, week 5, week 6 even still sees multiple undefeated teams. In this season, just 1. Hey, remember when Central Florida went undefeated in college football, but nobody considered them the best team in college football? It was because of their perceived lack of competition. It's a tough thing to say in the NFL, but not every NFL season is created equally, and this 1972 season was the equivalent of a mid-major college football conference. Yes, they deserve their credit. If it was easy and if this was not a good team, then they wouldn't have gone 14-0. They are a good team. Their C-score clears 33 points. That's an excellent score. It's just that other teams in more difficult NFL seasons without quite the record, still on the whole performed better. So having said all that, the Dolphins went to Super Bowl VII against the Washington Redskins, affectionately or maybe not so affectionately known as the Over the Hill Gang, and they were underdogs. Yes, the Redskins who were 11-3, the Dolphins who were 14-0. One might imagine the Dolphins would be heavy favorites, but no, they were underdogs. The odds makers of the day certainly knew what kind of team they were looking at. Now, of course, the Dolphins won this game. They successfully pounded the rock, played stifling defense, forcing 3 turnovers, and they survived Gary Apremian's absolute hilarity, and they wrapped up a perfect record, but certainly not a perfect season. At the edge of the top 20 is perhaps the best remembered of the Steelers' 1970s dynasty, the 1978 squad. This was the first NFL season with 16 regular season games, up from the 14 it used to be. The Steelers took advantage of that, winning 14 games for only the second time in league history, supplemented of course with those 2 losses. 195 points allowed in a 16-game season is very good, and it led the league. The only thing bringing this team down was the second easiest strength of schedule. It's this Super Bowl win over the Cowboys in Super Bowl XIII that is the major reason for this team's everlasting legacy. Prior to this game, the most points scored by a losing team in the Super Bowl was 17, when the Steelers defeated these same Cowboys just 3 seasons earlier. This was the first proper offensively explosive Super Bowl, although interestingly enough, the Cowboys only ever led 14-7 after a defensive score by linebacker Larry Hegman. The Steelers took off and had a 35-17 lead in the 4th and held on to win 35-31. But unfortunately for Cowboys fans, this game is most remembered for Hall of Fame tight end Jackie Smith dropping a wide open pass in the end zone, leading to the game's only field goal and somewhat accounting for the 4-point difference. The top 20 is now here, and we begin with another legendary defensive unit, that of the 2002 Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And if you're going to truly be a legendary defensive unit, you better lead the league in points allowed, and the Bucs did just that, allowing under 200 points in a much more offensive-friendly era. That was more than enough to cover for the offense, which was only 18th. They went 12-4, only going 2-2 in one-score games, piling up 10 two-score wins. They took care of business in the playoffs, and then they got to the Super Bowl, which was an interesting Super Bowl to say the least. John Gruden had spent the last 4 seasons as head coach of the Oakland Raiders, bringing them back to prominence. Tony Dungy had spent the last 6 seasons as head coach of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, bringing them to prominence for really the first time. Despite that feat by Dungy though, the Bucs weren't closing the deal, so he was let go and John Gruden was brought in to replace him. Gruden then led the team to Super Bowl 37 against, the Oakland Raiders, now led by Gruden assistant Bill Callahan, who didn't change the offense, allowing the Bucs D to pretty much know exactly what they were doing. The game, by the way, was a total blowout, 48-21, with the Bucs D scoring 3 touchdowns, a Super Bowl record that seems nigh impossible to ever break. Our next team is one that did not exactly undergo a slow grind to the top. At number 19 are the 1999 St. Louis Rams. From 1990 to 1998, the Rams posted a losing record every season, with all but one containing double-digit losses. To say they turned things around the next season is a massive understatement. Given how bad they were the year before, it's little surprise they had the league's easiest schedule. But they still went rampant over it, leading the league in scoring and kinda quietly finishing 4th in points allowed. Remarkably, at 13-3, they lost every one-score game they were in, while going 13-0 in multiple score games. That continued until the NFC title game, where they beat the Bucs by 5. That got them into the Super Bowl, and Super Bowl 34 will get many votes for the greatest Super Bowl ever played, and those votes are highly warranted. The Rams scored the first 16 points, then the Titans scored the next 16 points, and we were tied late in the 4th quarter when Kurt Warner found Isaac Bruce for a 73-yard go-ahead touchdown. It was now on the Titans to drive the ball 88 yards to tie the game. They very famously only drove it 87. Steve McNair threw the pass to Kevin Dyson, Mike Jones tackled him, and Dyson vainly reached the ball out to the end zone, only to not make it. 1 yard short. We travel back one season. The defending champion Denver Broncos returned in 1998 to win another Super Bowl and come in here at number 18. This team actually started the season 13-0 and were 1 week away from a matchup against the Miami Dolphins, which would have surely brought the 1972 team out from under their caves. But they lost, and they wound up losing that game to the Dolphins as well, their only 2 losses of the season. They compiled over 500 points, had a respectable defense, finishing 8th in the league in points allowed, and won 9 games by multiple scores, not including all the multiple score wins they had in the playoffs. That included Super Bowl 33. This matchup between the Broncos and the Atlanta Falcons contains the second best combined winning percentage between the two teams at .875, with each team going 14-2. And while Atlanta scored first and looked to be well into the game, that all came undone when Rod Smith, who actually didn't catch a pass in the previous season's Super Bowl, cooked Eugene Robinson, who was having his own problems, for an 80-yard touchdown to give Denver a 17-3 lead. Denver's offense kept humming, the defense forced Atlanta into 4 turnovers, and the repeat was complete with a 34-19 victory. Doomsday has returned, with the 1977 Dallas Cowboys sliding into the 17th spot. This is where we're seeing what we mentioned at the beginning of the video, that some of these margins are very, very slim. It just so happens that the Cowboys have slid just ahead of the teams we've already discussed. A 12-2 team that finished 2nd in scoring, only 8th in points allowed, racking up 7 multiple score victories, not counting what they did in the playoffs where they added 3 more. Their opponents in Super Bowl XII, the Denver Broncos, had never before made the playoffs in their entire history, let alone the Super Bowl. But this was a very good team this season, which makes Dallas's performance in this game all the more impressive. Holding the Broncos to 156 yards of offense is impressive on its own, but couple that with the fact that they forced 8 turnovers, 8, Forcing 2 turnovers in a quarter is pretty darn good. Well, Dallas did that on average for every quarter in this game, except that it never really was a game. The Cowboys dominated on the way to a 27-10 victory, the only other score other than 27-17 that has been repeated across 58 Super Bowls. While this team has since attracted some controversy, the 2009 New Orleans Saints grabbed the number 16 spot. This was a very unique season for the Saints. They jumped out to a 13-0 record before losing their last 3 games. Yet they still held on to the NFC's number 1 seed. The strength of this team was no question the offense, putting up 510 points, ranking first in the league. The defense, a bit mediocre at 20th, but their strength of schedule at 10th overall in the league did lift them up some more. They smashed the defending NFC champion Cardinals in the first round of the playoffs, and then beat the Vikings in a very tricky game in the NFC title game, which again has been the source of much controversy since. They then entered into their Super Bowl matchup with the Indianapolis Colts as underdogs, and after the Colts jumped out to a 10-0 first half lead, that seemed justified. But when the Saints, trailing 10-6 at the start of the second half, opened that half with a successful onside kick, which the Saints then converted into their first touchdown of the game, the tables had turned. Tracy Porter's pick 6 as the Colts looked to try to tie the game in the fourth quarter put it away for good. An interesting note on this Super Bowl, we mentioned that the Saints had the NFC's number 1 seed. So too did the Colts have the AFC's number 1 seed. This marked the first time in 16 years that the number 1 seed from each conference made it to the Super Bowl, and only the 3rd time in the 20 seasons since 6 teams from the conference qualified for the playoffs. This team, the 1969 Kansas City Chiefs, is the first true wildcard team to win the Super Bowl, although they aren't recognized as such. Maybe it's just easier then to call them the first non-division champion to ever win the Super Bowl. That said, this is an excellent team. They went 11-3 with a 2-3 record in one-score games, meaning in the rest of their games they were fairly dominant. They put up the second most points in the AFL that year while trotting out the best defense. They went through a couple of low-scoring games in the AFL playoffs, including in the title game against their division rival Oakland Raiders, before heading in to the final Super Bowl between AFL and NFL champion. And as the final AFL champion before the leagues merged into one, the Chiefs faced about the same odds they did against the Packers 3 years earlier, and as every other AFL team has against any other NFL team. They were heavy underdogs. And hey, this Minnesota Vikings team was excellent, but the Chiefs controlled the action, finally getting into the end zone after 3 Jan Stenerud field goals. Once the Vikings finally got on the board, naturally in the second half, Kansas City salted the game away with Otis Taylor's electric 46-yard touchdown, sealing the final score victory of 23-7 and closing a chapter in NFL history. A slightly different form of the Pittsburgh Steelers dynasty appeared in 1979 to take our number 14 spot. The defense was still excellent, finishing 5th in the league in points allowed, but now it was the offense essentially carrying the team. Number 1 in the league with 416 points scored. They did all this against a top 10 strength of schedule, number 6 actually, and they won 8 games by multiple scores. They won the AFC Divisional by multiple scores, and then they won the AFC title game by multiple scores, and then they entered Super Bowl 14. The Steelers' opponent in that game, the Los Angeles Rams, rank out as the worst team to ever make the Super Bowl. Spoiler alert for a future video. Yet the Rams led at the end of the first, the second, and the third quarter, but not at the end of the fourth. Pittsburgh finally took the lead for good on a 75-yard touchdown reception by John Stallworth. Then Franco Harris tacked one on for good measure, giving us the final score of 31-19. With this victory, the Steelers won their 4th Super Bowl in a 6-year span, an unprecedented and as of yet unmatched feat in the Super Bowl era. The curtain eventually came down, but it did so with a flourish. This is the final of the 6 Patriots Super Bowl champs, and it is the best of the group for sure, but not quite top 10 good from 2004. What makes this team so good is its balance, and when you hear the word balance, sometimes you think average. We're talking about balance at the highest level. A 14-2 record, 10 multiple score wins, 4th in scoring, 2nd in points allowed, and a top 10 schedule. And they went through the playoffs and beat a couple of good teams, the Indianapolis Colts and the 15-1 Pittsburgh Steelers. Interestingly enough, the Steelers beat the Patriots during the regular season, had a better record than them, hosted them in the AFC title game, and they were still underdogs. Records aren't everything. Super Bowl 39 against the Eagles was tied at 0 at the end of 1, tied at 7 at the half, and tied at 14 at the end of 3. But it felt like the Patriots were in control all the way throughout. It was in the 4th quarter where the Patriots were the first team in this game to take a 2-score lead following a Corey Dillon touchdown run and an Adam Vinatieri field goal. The Eagles eventually scored following the least urgent drive you'll ever see in an attempt to get back into a game, let alone in the Super Bowl, before Rodney Harrison's 2nd interception of the game and his 4th of the playoffs completely sealed the deal. We've had some fun with the New York Giants in this countdown, but at number 12, this 1986 team was legit. That said, they did put up a lot of one-score victories, 3 in a row at one point and then 6 in a row at another point. But they did still go 5-0 in multiple score games on the way to a 14-2 overall record. Top 10 in every category, points scored 8th, points allowed 2nd, strength of schedule 10th. It's what they did in the playoffs that really pushed this team up, annihilating the 49ers 49-3 in another game I don't like to talk about, before shutting out the Redskins in the NFC title game. Twice in Super Bowl history, a team was down 10-9 at the half before coming back to win. The 2011 Giants were the second, and this Giants team was the first. The Giants, though, blew up in the second half with 4 touchdowns, kicked off by a pass from Phil Simms to Mark Bavaro, a part of Simms' 22 for 25 passing performance, still a Super Bowl record for completion percentage at 88%. This was the last time, and it will probably remain the last time forever, that a defensive player won league MVP. That player was linebacker Lawrence Taylor, one of the greats of all time, and he was able to cap off this historic year with a decisive Super Bowl victory by his team. Just missing out on the top 20 is the team that kicked off the early 90s dynasty of the Dallas Cowboys, the 1992 team. It was only 3 years earlier that this Cowboy team was 1-15, but they turned it around with a bunch of draft picks in the now famous Herschel Walker trade, built the team together, and scorched out to a 13-3 record. They did so with the 2nd highest scoring offense and the 5th most stingiest defense in the league. It's in the playoffs where this team shined though, getting through all of their wins with relative ease. Included in that was on the road in the NFC title game against an excellent 49er team. Then they went to the Super Bowl. Did you know that the Buffalo Bills led this game and they did so by an entire touchdown? It's a true story. It didn't last. Although the 35-point Cowboys victory wasn't a Super Bowl record, many may argue that this was indeed the most dominant Super Bowl win of all time. The Cowboys forced 9 turnovers. Every 6 minutes and 40 seconds of game clock, on average, the Bills turned it over. Dallas returned 2 of those for touchdowns, and it would have been a third had Leon Lett not tried to channel his inner Michael Irvin. A score that would have given the Cowboys 59 points and broken the record for most points scored by one team in a Super Bowl. We enter the hallowed halls of the top 10 with a team that may surprise some, the 2013 Seattle Seahawks. If you've been paying attention during this time though, it really shouldn't come as a surprise. This was a dominant unit, going 13-3 with a perfect record in multiple score games. A couple of those one-score games turned around, we're looking at a 15-1 team that raises its profile in the eyes of many experts. No such profile raising is needed here. We get how good they were, led by their dominant, best in the league scoring defense. The offense was no slouch at 8th overall, all while playing a schedule in the top 10. Their most famous game of the season was in the NFC title game against their arch rival San Francisco 49ers, where Richard Sherman knocked away the pass intended for Michael Crabtree for Malcolm Smith to intercept the ball and end the game. And of course, there was Sherman's post-game interview with Aaron Andrews. But that may have only been their most famous game until the next one. The Seahawks set a unique Super Bowl record in this game that will be tough to ever top. They led the game for 59 minutes and 48 seconds. That means they led for 99.67% of the game. Another 35-point victory like the 92 Cowboys before them. Many may argue that this was the most dominant Super Bowl win of all time. The Seahawks held the Broncos to 8 points, the first time in 13 years and only the second time in 40 years that a team was held to single digits in the Super Bowl. But this wasn't just any team and it wasn't just any offense. The Broncos set a still standing record of 606 points scored, nearly 38 per game, and the Legion of Boom absolutely shut them down. If you happen to be keeping track here, you will notice that this is the final team from the 21st century, leaving the rest of the countdown to teams from the 1900s. Coming in at number 9 are the rebuilt San Francisco 49ers of 1994. Rebuilt because having lost to the Cowboys in consecutive NFC title games, they made some moves to make sure they could get past them this season. And those moves were mostly made, almost entirely made actually, on defense. It was a couple of great draft picks in Bryant Young and Lee Woodall, and some free agent acquisitions, none more renowned than Deion Sanders. The offense continued to hum along. They were number 1 in the league in scoring. Their defense pulled up to a number 6 spot in points allowed. They put up 10 multiple score wins with their 1 multiple score loss, that bizarre game against the Eagles, where they lost at home 40-8. Their 13-3 record against the league's easiest schedule was still powerful, and they kicked some butt in the playoffs and finally avenged the Cowboys by beating them in the NFC title game, almost blowing a 21-point lead, but never trailing. And in this era where the NFC Championship game was considered the true Super Bowl, especially when it was the 49ers and Cowboys, the Super Bowl tended to be a bit anticlimactic. This 49ers-Chargers Super Bowl fit that bill, with the entire game essentially a coronation for the Niners. Not to say that they didn't do anything. Jerry Rice tied his own Super Bowl record with 3 touchdown receptions, and Ricky Watters added 3 touchdowns of his own. 2 teammates scoring 3 touchdowns in the same Super Bowl. Good luck ever seeing that again. The 49ers scored 49 points, drowned the Chargers, and saved the entire NFL universe from the Dallas Cowboys winning 4 straight Super Bowls. Cowboys fans, as many of you know, can be a bit insufferable now. Can you imagine them with that on their resume? You're welcome. The best of the Steeler dynasty was indeed the 1975 team, and they come in here at number 8. Winning 9 multiple score games in a 14-game season is ridiculous, but that's what this team did, going 12-2, finishing 2nd in points allowed, and still with their offense being underrated at 5th overall. They beat up on the Colts in the playoffs, had to get by the Raiders to make it to the Super Bowl, where they matched up with the Dallas Cowboys. Now, this Super Bowl isn't the first time that we're seeing the Steelers entering the 4th quarter losing. They were down 10-7 before scoring 14 points in the fourth quarter in a most unique way: a safety, 2 field goals, and a touchdown without the extra point. In control of the game now, Dallas had to get on the comeback trail, and they did that, with Percy Howard catching the one and only pass of his entire NFL career, which just so happened to be a touchdown in the Super Bowl, before Steelers safety Glenn Edwards finally ended the Cowboys' threat with an interception. Even though only 10 Super Bowls had been played to this point, the Steelers became the 3rd team to go back-to-back. The first ever Super Bowl champions, the Vince Lombardi-led 1966 Green Bay Packers, have seen only 6 champions surpass them over the next 57 years. The Packers were indeed NFL champions the year before, kind of making this a back-to-back for them. With the NFL and AFL agreeing to merge, the NFL champions for the first time would be playing the AFL champions. And no better team could represent the NFL than this Packers squad. The first team we've seen to clear the 40-point mark in C-score. Remarkable achievement. They went 12-2, and like so many other teams that are getting into this top 10, went undefeated 8-0 in multiple score games. They cranked out the best scoring defense in the league. They got through the Cowboys, won the NFL for the 2nd straight year, and went into uncharted territory. See, Super Bowl I wasn't Super Bowl I when it happened. It was known as the AFL-NFL World Championship game, and was indeed the first game ever played between the leagues. Green Bay only led 14-10 at the half, but they pulled away in the second half, taking down the AFL champion Kansas City Chiefs in convincing fashion, 35-10, demonstrating the power of the NFL over the upstart AFL. The best story of this game, though, was Packers backup wide receiver Max McGee. 34 years old and literally hungover, he was pressed into action, and with 41 catches for 91 yards and a single touchdown all season, he had 7 catches for 138 yards and 2 touchdowns in this game alone, and goes down in history forever as having scored the first ever Super Bowl touchdown. Imagine one of the greatest Super Bowl champions of all time turning around and drafting the greatest wide receiver who ever lived the next season. There is no need to imagine. This happened on the backs of a 1984 Super Bowl championship by the 49ers. This team went 15-1, the first team to ever get 15 regular season victories. They went 10-0 in multiple score games, finished 2nd in the league in scoring, and 1st in points allowed. The only thing that brought this team down was their strength of schedule, the 2nd easiest in the league. They proved their worth in the playoffs, though, getting past the New York Giants before shutting out the Chicago Bears and advancing to Super Bowl XIX. It'll be tough to ever top the combined 29-3 record that the Niners and Dolphins brought into this game, a .906 winning percentage. And while the game was kind of back and forth early on, the Dolphins proved too one-dimensional, while the 49ers brought the greatness in both their offensive and their defensive units. That's the thing with the 1980s 49ers. Their defenses were always overlooked in favor of the glamour of their offenses. With their 38-16 victory, the Niners held the Dolphins to their lowest point total of the entire season, proving that football is truly played on both sides of the ball, closing out a dominant 18-1 season with their only loss by a single field goal. We're in the rarefied air of the top 5, and this right here is the greatest Miami Dolphins team of all time, at number 5, with the follow-up to the undefeated team in 1973. Yes, it's very obvious looking at the record that it's not as good. They were 14-0 the year before and 12-2 this season. But they also put up 10 multiple score victories, still led the league in scoring defense, dropped a little bit in the offense to 5th, but the strength of schedule was much better at middle of the pack and the league as a whole improved. It's like they won the Sun Belt Conference in 1972, graduated to the SEC in 1973, didn't put up the same record, but won that also. And it was their playoff performances that were much better. The 72 Dolphins won their 3 playoff games by a combined 17 points. This Dolphins team won each of their playoff games by at least 17 points individually. So unlike the previous season's playoff run, it was essentially smooth sailing all the way for the 73 Dolphins. They cruised out to a 24-0 fourth quarter lead in Super Bowl VIII before the Vikings saved their blushes and avoided the shutout. And they were dominant in this game, running the ball 53 times with only 7, count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 passing attempts. In the modern NFL, teams throw the ball 7 times or more on a single drive. Larry Zonka led the way with 33 of those carries as the Dolphins pounded Minnesota into submission and surpassed the 1972 team. Records be damned. This is the 3rd different 49er team in the top 10 and the best of them all. At number 4, the 1989 San Francisco 49ers. As crazy as it is to believe, this is the first 49er team after the retirement of Bill Walsh. They smartly promoted from within, and George Seifert took over the team, and he very smartly didn't change anything. The 49ers cruised to a 14-2 record, and we see once again a team with 10 multiple score victories. They led the league in scoring, and as usual, their defense was stellar, finishing 3rd. The strength of schedule wasn't overly impressive, 5th from the easiest in the league, but when you dominate a schedule, it really doesn't matter how easy it is. That said, the 49ers certainly made the Super Bowl, and really, there's not much to talk about as it pertains to the Super Bowl, except for all the records the 49ers set, many of which still stand. Chief among those records are most points scored with 55 and largest margin of victory at 45. The 49ers entered the end zone 8 times in this game, and Denver's touchdown came after a shoddy penalty call, so this could have easily been 56-3. Never mind that the 49ers hit their final point total with just under 14 full minutes remaining in the game. In the aftermath, the 49ers completed the most dominant playoff performance in NFL history, winning their 3 playoff games by a combined 100 points on the dot. Even with many teams playing 4 playoff games now, this record will stand forever. A 33-point win in the NFL playoffs is an astonishing accomplishment. The 89 49ers averaged more than that. This team tends to get overlooked for some reason, but we're not going to be doing that. At number 3, we have the powerhouse 1996 Green Bay Packers. The main reason why this team might get overlooked is because their championship came on the heels of a dominant 49er Cowboy run where the two teams combined to win the previous 4 Super Bowls, while the Packers were clawing to get into that tier. They did that this season. Their C-score cleared 45 points. They led the league in both scoring and points allowed, and they did so against a decent middle-of-the-pack schedule. They took care of the 49ers in the divisional round, and they beat up on the Panthers to make it into the Super Bowl. Now the Packers were in a little bit of a fight in this game, relinquishing their 10-0 first quarter lead over the Patriots before that first quarter was even over. Trailing 14-10 in the second, They piled on 17 quick points, including a then Super Bowl record 81-yard touchdown reception by receiver Antonio Freeman. And when the Patriots threatened to claw back into the game with a late third quarter touchdown, Desmond Howard took the ensuing kickoff back to the house to put the Packers ahead 35-21, which also served as the final score. Howard remains the only special teamer to ever win Super Bowl MVP, putting a bow on this captivating season. Much like the Packers before them, the 1991 Washington Redskins tend to get overlooked as an all-time great team. And once again, we're not doing that. They slide right in to the number 2 spot. And the reason they got overlooked was probably about the same as the Packers, as they were on the other side of that 4-year run of the 49ers and the Cowboys. But take a look at their C-score. The Packers had a 45.5. The Redskins jump up 6 points to 51.467. This team was more than 50% better than an average NFL team, and that reflects here in the numbers. They went 14-2, winning 9 games by multiple scores, leading the league in scoring, and just finishing second in points allowed. They did so tied for the 13th hardest schedule in the league, which is in the upper half. Their playoff opponents, the Falcons and the Lions, weren't exactly stalwarts at the time, but they did get to the point that they did in the playoffs, and the Redskins took care of them handily. The Redskins then beat the Bills 37-24 in Super Bowl 26, but that final score does not tell the story of the Redskin dominance. They led 24-0 and 37-10 before Buffalo softened the margin with 2 inconsequential fourth quarter touchdowns. Washington went over 400 yards of offense, held the Bills under 300 despite the late flurry, and forced 5 Buffalo turnovers. It could have been even worse, as Buffalo fumbled 6 times in this game, only losing 1. The Redskins' top-to-bottom balance and consistent dominance carried from the first game of the season to the last, leaving behind a legacy that just missed seeing them crowned as the greatest Super Bowl champion of all time. And we mean just missed, by less than a single point of C-score in fact, but in the end, the greatest Super Bowl champion of all time is a team that truly lives up to its legacy and its reputation. The monsters of the Midway, the masters of the Super Bowl Shuffle, the 1985 Chicago Bears. What a team this was. They went 15-1 the season after the 49ers accomplished that feat too. But look at that record in multiple score games. 13-1. Only twice the Bears had to win a game by a single score. They won 13 games by multiple scores, which is more than many teams can win in a single season of any variety. Known primarily for their defense, they still finished second in the league in scoring, and of course led the league in scoring defense, all while playing a middle-of-the-road schedule at 15th hardest in the league. Then came the playoffs. They won their 2 playoff games and advanced to Super Bowl 20 without allowing a single point. When Walter Payton, the greatest running back of all time, lost the fumble on the second play of that Super Bowl, the Bears defense came out and allowed 0 yards over the next 3 plays. Yet the Patriots had the ball in field goal range and they kicked that field goal, taking a 3-0 lead. These were the first points the Bears allowed, period, in the playoffs. They proceeded to score the next 44 points, treating their opponents as if they were the junior varsity, something they did to many a team in 1985. Their 46-10 final score victory, a Super Bowl record at the time for largest margin, and still the second largest margin in Super Bowl history, doesn't even begin to explain the amount of damage the Bears inflicted. The 1985 Chicago Bears stand above all else, the single greatest Super Bowl champion ever, and the NFL's greatest team of the Super Bowl era. This was a long one. Thank you so much for sticking around for the whole thing. We're not going to draw out the ending, but please give the video a like and a share, and give the channel a subscribe if you don't mind. We will catch you next time, and until then, I hope you have an awesome day.